Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. The link between cancer cases and cancer-causing chemicals in Poe Hall is still being investigated by federal health officials. But WRAL 5 on Your Side's own reporting has uncovered some startling findings. Our team mapped out reported cases alongside PCB test results in the building. Here to break down what we found is 5 on Your Side's Keely Arthur. Keely, thanks for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Let's get into the background here. We've been covering this case for a while. What are PCBs and who did these tests?
PCBs are a group of man-made chemicals that were really popular in the 1950s until the late 1970s. They were manufactured in large part by Monsanto, and they were in a whole slew of different things. So they're in paint, they're in caulking, they're in sealant, they're in machinery, they're in televisions, they're in fluorescent lights. They're everywhere. And what PCB scientists have explained to me is that because they don't really degrade over time, the thinking was that if you had products with these chemicals in them, the products would last longer. So people would use these PCB products in buildings that were high traffic, like municipal buildings and schools, thinking that because there's a lot of wear and tear on these buildings, the chemicals will help keep everything running. There'd be no damage. And that's exactly the problem now. We've since realized that these chemicals are really harmful to people, and because they don't degrade, they're stuck in a lot of buildings, including Poe Hall. And so NC State and a consulting firm that it hired conducted testing on Poe Hall. There was testing taken in 2018, 2023, and 2024, and we combined all of the PCB testing data into kind of a one-stop shop for anyone interested.
How many cases of cancer diagnoses are we aware of among people who spent time in Poe Hall?
Everything has been self-reported, and in the last year and a month since Poe closed, 215 people have come to WRAL, come to me to say that they are living with cancer, and the common thread of all of them is that they worked or studied inside Poe Hall.
Okay, and in your investigation that aired at 6 on WRAL on Thursday, you showed this map of Poe Hall and the data from these testings and these reported cases. What did it all seem to tell us?
Well, it wasn't necessarily meant to tell us anything new. We've had these results since June, but they were released in a 1,000-page document, and they're complicated scientific samples. So if you're a student at NC State and you're interested in where the chemicals were found, you might not have a very easy time reading it. So the point of this for us was to really distill down all that data and make it easy for people to understand. And what we found is there was contamination on every single floor of the building. And the researchers who conducted the testing believe that the source of the contamination is inside the building's HVAC system. That is still up for debate a little bit. Some of the experts I've spoken to say that they think the caulking that was found on the exterior of the building in extremely high contamination levels could also be a source. But basically, the findings are the building is contaminated with PCBs.
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. Keely, how exactly did the 5 on Your Side team put that map together? Because it was pretty intense stuff that in terms of graphic design for this one.
Yes, it was. And the graphic design was done by our amazing graphic designer, Shan Zong. We gave him floor maps from Poe Hall. These are, from our understanding, the most up-to-date floor maps because the building had been through renovations. It's been open for 50 years before it closed, a little bit more than that. And that was the graphics part of it. And then the other part of it was going through all of this data and putting it into a spreadsheet so people could look very easily and see whatever they were looking for. Let's say you were a student at NC State and you spent time on the second floor in Poe Hall and you had a class in room 216. You can go to our spreadsheet now, click on 216 and see if anything was sampled, and if it was, what the contamination showed.
And I know there were some specific examples that you get into in that story that aired on Thursday of people who were in that building and kind of putting that up against what the data showed about the rooms that they spent the most time in. Why was it important to show the data in that way? And were you surprised by any of the findings just by seeing it visually?
Yeah, one of the things that we've covered a lot with Poe Hall is a certain level of criticism from the people who say they think the building may have given them cancer. They've been critical of a lot of different facets of this situation, but one of the things many people were critical of was the fact that there were only about 245 samples taken in the building. While that may sound like a lot, Poe Hall is 7 stories high and has hundreds of rooms in it. And I've spoken with PCB experts who say taking 30 samples per room can give you a good sense of what's actually going on in a building. So people were upset that there were fewer samples taken than what they had hoped, and later petitioned in court to be able to do their own testing. Those results have not been out yet. But what we found is that about half of the 215 people who reported having cancer to us could remember where they spent time in the building. And in some cases, their offices were tested. In one case on the 6th floor, a office has 3 people who spent time in that room and all later developed cancer. Then on the 3rd floor, and I should say in that particular case, the PCB contamination level is hundreds of times higher than what the EPA deems unsafe. So lots of contamination in that particular sampling area. Then you go to the 3rd floor, and there's also some contaminants found. And I had 2 grad students who were in the building for 4 years in the early 2010s. They both spent a lot of time on the 3rd floor in certain rooms. They both were diagnosed with cancer, leukemia, within 7 months of each other last year. Now, they did not believe their offices were tested based off of where they remembered staying. We looked, and there were no samples taken in those rooms. So it was just important for us, if we have all these folks with cancer, where were they spending time in the building? Was that tested? And, as more people come forward and as more testing results potentially come out, we might get a better sense of the exposure in the building.
And when might we hear more about the results of that testing that's ongoing and, of course, the CDC's investigation into a possible link between these cases and the PCBs?
Right. Yeah, there's still so much happening with this story. As far as the federal health investigation that you just mentioned, it sounds like we may get some sort of update early next year, but that's unclear. The CDC does not update people during an active investigation, so we're kind of just waiting right now. But those investigations typically take about a year, and we are going to hit the year mark in mid-February. And then your other question about the additional testing. So Darren Major, one of the people with leukemia that I was referencing, filed a petition to be able to test more in the building with his own team of testers, independent of NC State, because there's a lot of distrust going on right now. He was granted that access in late June, early August, and from my understanding, those test results will come out again early next year, because the lawyers who are representing many of the people we've spoken to plan to file lawsuits against Monsanto and NC State, and they will use their testing data in that. That's my understanding, at least.
Okay. Well, a lot to still be developing in this story. Thank you so much, Keely, for staying on top of it. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.